Under the Hill. A romantic novel. Tug Most Eminent and Reverend Prince. Giulio Poldo Petzela, Cardinal of the Holy Roman Church, titular Bishop of Esmeralda in Trastevere, Archbishop of Ostia and Velletri Nuncio to the Holy See in Nicaragua and Patagonia, Father to the poor, reformer of ecclesiastical discipline, a pattern of learning, wisdom, and holiness of life. This book is dedicated with due reverence. C.B. his humble servant, a scrivener and limner of worldly things, who made this book. Aubrey Beardsley. Most Eminent Prince. I know not by what mischance the writing of epistles dedicatory has fallen into disuse, whether through the vanity of authors or the humility of patrons. But the practice seems to me so very beautiful and becoming that I have ventured to make an essay in the modest art, and lay with formalities my first book at your feet. I have, it must be confessed, many fears lest I shall be arraigned of presumption in choosing so exalted a name as your own to place at the beginning of this history, but I hope that such a censure will not be too lightly passed upon me, for if I am guilty it is but of a most natural pride that the accidents of my life should allow me to sail the little pinnace of my wit under your protection. But though I can clear myself of such a charge, I am still minded to use the tongue of apology, for with what face can I offer you a book treating of so vain and fantastical a thing as love? I know that in the judgment of many the amorous passion is accounted a shameful thing and ridiculous. Indeed it must be confessed that more blushes have risen for love's sake than for any other cause, and that lovers are an eternal laughing-stock. Still, as the book will be found to contain matter of deeper import than mere venery, inasmuch as it treats of the great contrition of its chiefest character, and of canonical things in certain pages, I am not without hopes that your eminence will pardon my writing of a loving ave, for which extravagance let my youth excuse me. Then I must crave your forgiveness for addressing you in a language other than the Roman, but my small freedom in latinity forbids me to wander beyond the idiom of my vernacular. I would not for the world that your delicate southern ear should be offended by a barbarous assault of rude and Gothic words, but methinks no language is rude that can boast polite writers, and not a few such have flourished in this country in times past, bringing our common speech to very great perfection. In the present age, alas, our pens are ravished by unlettered authors and unmannered critics, that make a havoc rather than a building, a wilderness rather than a garden. But, alack, what boots it to drop tears upon the preterite? It is not of our own shortcomings though, but of your own great merits that I should speak, else I should be forgetful of the duties I have drawn upon myself in electing to address you. In a dedication. It is of your noble virtues, though all the world know of them, your taste and wit, your care for letters, and very real regard for the arts, that I must be the proclaimer. Though it be true that all men have sufficient wit to pass a judgment on this or that, and not a few sufficient impudence to print the same, these last being commonly accounted critics, I have ever held that the critical faculty is more rare than the inventive. It is a faculty your eminence possesses in so great a degree that your praise or blame is something oracular, your utterance infallible as great genius or as a beautiful woman. Your mind, I know, rejoicing in fine distinctions and subtle procedures of thought, beautifully discursive rather than hastily conclusive, has found in criticism its happiest exercise. It is a pity that so perfect a Messinist should have no horrors to befriend, no Georgies to accept, for the offices and function of patron or critic must of necessity be lessened in an age of little men and little work. In times past it was nothing derogatory for great princes and men of state to extend their loves and favor to poets, for thereby they received as much honor as they conferred. Did not Prince Festus with pride take the masterwork of Julian into his protection, and was not the Aeneis a pretty thing to offer Caesar? Learning without appreciation is a thing of naught, but I know not which is greatest in you, your love of the arts, or your knowledge of them. What wonder then that I am studious to please you, and desirous of your protection? How deeply thankful I am for your past affections you know well, your great kindness and liberality having far outgone my slight merits and small accomplishment that seemed scarce to warrant any favor. Alas, 'tis a slight offering I make you now, but if after glancing into its pages, say of an evening upon your terrace, you should deem it worthy of the remotest place in your princely library, the knowledge that it rested there would be reward sufficient for my labors, and a crowning happiness to my pleasure in the writing of this slender book. The humble and obedient servant of your eminence. Aubrey Beardsley. Under the Hill. A romantic novel. Chapter I. The Abbé Fanfrelucky, having lighted off his horse, stood doubtfully for a moment beneath the ombre gateway of the mysterious hill, troubled with an exquisite fear lest a day's travel should have too cruelly undone the laboured niceness of his dress. His hand, slim and gracious as La Marquise du Deffand's in the drawing by Carmentelli, played nervously about the gold hair that fell upon his shoulders like a finely curled brook, and from point to point of a precise toilet the fingers wandered, quelling the little mutinies of cravat and ruffle. It was taper time, when the tired earth puts on its cloak of mist and shadows, when the enchanted woods are stirred with light footfalls and slender voices of the fairies, when all the air is full of delicate influences, and even the beaux, seated at their dressing tables, dream a little. A delicious moment, thought Fanfrelucky, to slip into exile. The place where he stood waved drowsily with strange flowers, heavy with perfume, dripping with odors. Gloomy and nameless weeds not to be found in Mentzelias. Huge moths, so richly winged they must have banqueted upon tapestries and royal stuffs, slept on the pillars that flanked either side of the gateway, and the eyes of all the moths remained open and were burning and bursting with a mesh of veins. The pillars were fashioned in some pale stone and rose up like hymns in the praise of pleasure, for from cap to base, each one was carved with loving sculptures, showing such a cunning invention and such a curious knowledge, that Fanfrelucky lingered not a little in reviewing them. They surpassed all that Japan has ever pictured from her Mason's beards, all that was ever painted in the cool bathrooms of Cardinal Lamotte, and even outdid the astonishing illustrations to Jones's nursery numbers. A pretty portal, murmured the Abbé, correcting his sash. As he spoke, a faint sound of singing was breathed out from the mountain, faint music as strange and distant as sea legends that are heard in shells. The Vespers of Helen, I take it, said Fanfrelucky, and struck a few chords of accompaniment, ever so lightly, upon his little lute. Softly across the spellbound threshold the song floated and wreathed itself about the subtle columns, till the moths were touched with passion and moved quaintly in their sleep. One of them was awakened by the intenser notes of the Abbé's lute strings, and fluttered into the cave. Fanfrelucky felt it was his cue for entry. The Abbé. Adieu, he exclaimed with an inclusive gesture, and goodbye, Madonna, as the cold circle of the moon began to show, beautiful and full of enchantments. There was a shadow of sentiment in his voice as he spoke the words. Would to heaven, he sighed, I might receive the assurance of a looking glass before I make my debut. However, as she is a goddess, I doubt not her eyes are a little sated with perfection, and may not be displeased to see it crowned with a tiny fault. A wild rose had caught upon the trimmings of his ruff, and in the first flush of displeasure he would have struck it brusquely away, and most severely punished the offending flower. But the ruffled mood lasted only a moment, for there was something so deliciously incongruous in the hardy petal's invasion of so delicate a thing, that Fanfrelucky withheld the finger of resentment and doubt that the wild rose should stay where it had clung a passport, as it were, from the upper to the underworld. The very excess and violence of the fault, he said, will be its excuse, and, undoing a tangle in the tassel of his stick, stepped into the shadowy corridor that ran into the bosom of the one hill stepped with the admirable aplomb and unwrinkled suavity of Don John. Chapter 2. Before a toilet that shone like the altar of Notre Dame de Victoires, Helen was seated in a little dressing gown of black and heliotrope. The coiffeur Cosmo was caring for her scented chevelure, and with tiny silver tongs, warm from the caresses of the flame, made delicious intelligent curls that fell as lightly as a breath about her forehead and over her eyebrows, and clustered like tendrils round her neck. Her three favorite girls, Papillard, Blanche Mains, and Lorraine, waited immediately upon her with perfume and powder in delicate flagons and frail cassolettes, and held in porcelain jars the ravishing paints prepared by Chatelaine for those cheeks and lips that had grown a little pale with anguish of exile. Her three favorite boys, Claude, Claire, and Sarrasine, stood amorously about with salver, fan, and napkin. Millamant held a slight tray of slippers, Minette some tender gloves, La Poplinier, mistress of the robes, was ready with a frock of yellow and white, La Zampinella bore the jewels, Florizel some flowers, Amador a box of various pins, and Wadius a box of sweets. Her doves, ever in attendance, walked about the room that was paneled with the gallant paintings of Jean-Baptiste Drouot, and some dwarfs and doubtful creatures sat here and there lolling out their tongues, pinching each other, and behaving oddly enough. Sometimes Helen gave them little smiles. The toilet of Helen. As the toilet was in progress, Mrs. Marsible, the fat manicure and fardeuse, strode in and seated herself by the side of the dressing table, greeting Helen with an intimate nod. She wore a gown of white watered silk with gold lace trimmings, and a velvet necklet of false vermilion. Her hair hung in bandeaux over her ears, passing into a huge chignon at the back of her head, and the hat, wide-brimmed and hung with a valance of pink muslin, was floral with red roses. Mrs. Marsible's voice was full of salacious unction. She had terrible little gestures with the hands, strange movements with the shoulders, a short respiration that made surprising wrinkles in her bodice, a corrupt skin, large horny eyes, a parrot's nose, a small loose mouth, great flaccid cheeks, and chin after chin. She was a wise person, and Helen loved her more than any other of her servants, and had 100 pet names for her, such as Dear Toad, Pretty Pole, Cock Robin, Dearest Lip, Touchstone, Little Cough Drop, Bijou, Buttons, Dear Heart, Dick Doc, Mrs. Manley, Little Nipper, Cochon de la, Naughty Naughty, Blessed Thing, and Trump. The talk that passed between Mrs. Marsible and her mistress was of that excellent kind that passes between old friends, a perfect understanding giving to scraps of phrases their full meaning, and to the merest reference a point. Naturally Fanfrelucky the newcomer was discussed a little. Helen had not seen him yet, and asked a score of questions on his account that were delightfully to the point. The report and the coiffing were completed at the same moment. Cosma, said Helen, you have been quite sweet and quite brilliant, you have surpassed yourself tonight. Madam flatters me, replied the antique old thing, with a girlish giggle under his black satin mask. Gad, madam, sometimes I believe I have no talent in the world, but tonight I must confess to a touch of the vain mood. It would pain me horribly to tell you about the painting of her face, suffice it that the sorrowful work was accomplished, frankly, magnificently, and without a shadow of deception. Helen slipped away the dressing gown, and rose before the mirror in a flutter of frilled things. She was adorably tall and slender. Her neck and shoulders were wonderfully drawn, and the little malicious breasts were full of the irritation of loveliness that can never be entirely comprehended, or ever enjoyed to the utmost. Her arms and hands were loosely, but delicately articulated, and her legs were divinely long. From the hip to the knee, 22 inches, from the knee to the heel, 22 inches, as befitted a goddess. Those who have seen Helen only in the Vatican, in the Louvre, in the Uffizi, or in the British Museum, can have no idea how very beautiful and sweet she looked. Not at all like the lady in La Bruyere. Mrs. Marsible grew quite lyric over the dear little person, and pecked at her arms with kisses. Dear tongue, you must really behave yourself, said Helen, and called Willamette to bring her the slippers. The tray was freighted with the most exquisite and shapely pantoufles, sufficient to make Cluny a place of naught. There were shoes of grey and black and brown suede, of white silk and rose satin, and velvet and sarcenet. There were some of sea green sewn with cherry blossoms, some of red with willow branches, and some of grey with bright-winged birds. There were heels of silver, of ivory, and of gilt. There were buckles of very precious stones set in most strange and esoteric devices. There were ribbons tied and twisted into cunning forms. There were buttons so beautiful that the buttonholes might have no pleasure till they closed upon them. There were soles of delicate leather scented with miracle, and linings of soft stuff scented with the juice of July flowers. But Helen, finding none of them to her mind, called for a discarded pair of blood-red Moroccan, diapered with pearls. These looked very distinguished over her white silk stockings. Meantime, La Poplinier stepped forward with the frock. I shan't wear one tonight, said Helen. Then she slipped on her gloves. When the toilet was at an end, all her doves clustered round her feet, loving to frolic her ankles with their plumes, and the dwarfs clapped their hands, and put their fingers between their lips and whistled. Never before had Helen been so radiant and compelling. Spire Dione, in the corner, looked up from his game of spell icons and trembled. Just then, Franz Mongel announced that supper was ready upon the 5th terrace. Ah, cried Helen, I'm famished. Chapter 3. She was quite delighted with Fanfrelucky, and, of course, he sat next to her at supper. The terrace, made beautiful with 1,000 vain and fantastical things, and set with 100 tables and 400 couches, presented a truly splendid appearance. In the middle was a huge bronze fountain with 3 basins. From the first rose a many-breasted dragon and 4 little loves mounted upon swans, and each love was furnished with a bow and arrow. 2 of them that faced the monster seemed to recoil in fear, 2 that were behind made bold enough to aim their shafts at him. From the verge of the second sprang a circle of slim golden columns that supported silver doves with tails and wings spread out. The third, held by a group of grotesquely attenuated satyrs, was centered with a thin pipe hung with masks and roses and capped with children's heads. From the mouths of the dragon and the loves, from the swan's eyes, from the breasts of the doves, from the satyr's horns and lips, from the masks at many points, and from the children's curls, the water played profusely, cutting strange arabesques and subtle figures. The terrace was lit entirely by candles. There were 4,000 of them, not numbering those upon the tables. The candlesticks were of a countless variety, and smiled with molded cochonneries. Some were 20 feet high, and bore single candles that flared like fragrant torches over the feast, and guttered till the wax stood round the tops in tall lances. Some, hung with dainty petticoats of shining lustres, had a whole bevy of tapers upon them devised in circles, in pyramids, in squares, in cuneiforms, in single lines regimentally and in crescents. Then on quaint pedestals and terminal gods and gracious pilasters of every sort, were shell-like vases of excessive fruits and flowers that hung about and burst over the edges and could never be restrained. The orange trees and myrtles, looped with vermilion sashes, stood in frail porcelain pots, and the rose trees were wound and twisted with superb invention over trellis and standard. Upon one side of the terrace a long gilded stage for the comedians was curtained off with Pagonian tapestries, and in front of it the music stands were placed. The tables arranged between the fountain and the flight of steps to the sixth terrace were all circular, covered with white damask, and strewn with irises, roses, kingcups, columbines, daffodils, carnations, and lilies, and the couches, high with soft cushions and spread with more stuffs than could be named, had fans thrown upon them. Beyond the espalier stretched the gardens, which were designed so elaborately and with so much splendor that the architect of the Fates d'Armel could have found in them no matter for cavil, and the still lake strewn with profuse barges full of gay flowers and wax marionettes, the alleys of tall trees, the arcades and cascades, the pavilions, the grottos and the garden gods all took a strange tinge of revelry from the glare of the light that fell upon them from the feast. The frogless Helen and Fanfrelucky, with Mrs. Marcible and Claude and Claire, and Farky, the chief comedian, sat at the same table. Fanfrelucky, who had doffed his traveling suit, wore long black silk stockings, a pair of pretty garters, a very elegant ruffled shirt, slippers, and a wonderful dressing gown, and Farky was in ordinary evening clothes. As for the rest of the company, it boasted some very noticeable dresses, and whole tables of quite delightful coiffures. There were spotted veils that seemed to stain the skin, fans with eyes slits in them, through which the bearers peeped and peered, fans painted with figures and covered with the sonnets of Sporian and the short stories of Scaramouche, and fans of big, living moths stuck upon mounts of silver sticks. There were masks of green velvet that make the face look trebly powdered, masks of the heads of birds, of apes, of serpents, of dolphins, of men and women, of little embryons and of cats, masks like the faces of gods. Masks of colored glass, and masks of thin talc and of India rubber. There were wigs of black and scarlet wools, of peacock's feathers, of gold and silver threads, of swan's down, of the tendrils of the vine, and of human hair, huge collars of stiff muslin rising high above the head, whole dresses of ostrich feathers curling inwards, tunics of panther skins that looked beautiful over pink tights, capotes of crimson satin trimmed with the wings of owls, sleeves cut into the shapes of apocryphal animals, drawers flounced down to the ankles, and flecked with tiny red roses, stockings clocked with fates galantes, and curious designs, and petticoats cut like artificial flowers. Some of the women had put on delightful little mustaches dyed in purples and bright greens, twisted and waxed with absolute skill, and some wore great white beards, after the manner of Saint Wilgeforte. Then Dora had painted extraordinary grotesques and vignettes over their bodies, here and there. Upon a cheek, an old man scratching his horned head, upon a forehead, an old woman teased by an impudent amour, upon a shoulder, an amorous seigneury, round a breast, a circlet of satyrs, about a wrist, a wreath of pale, unconscious babes, upon an elbow, a bouquet of spring flowers, across a back, some surprising scenes of adventure, at the corners of the mouth, tiny red spots, and upon a neck, a flight of birds, a caged parrot, a branch of fruit, a butterfly, a spider, a drunken dwarf, or, simply, some initials. The fruit bearers. The supper provided by the ingenious Rambouillet was quite beyond parallel. Never had he created a more exquisite menu. The consommé impromptu alone would have been sufficient to establish the immortal reputation of any chef. What, then, can I say of the Dorade Petit Sauce Miracle throughout auxiliary longues de carbs, the Ramuros à la charnière the Ciboulette de Jabir à l'Espignol, the Pate de Cuisses d'Oeil auxiliary poise de Monsalve Thecus d'Ano Claire de Lune Third Cots à la Grec Teacher Lot de Pomes à la Lucy Waters de Pomes à la Marie, and Fig Glacés auxiliary rayons d'Or. A veritable tour de cuisine that surpassed even the famous little suppers given by the Marquis de Regel at Passy, and which the Abbé Mirliton pronounced impeccable, and too good to be eaten. Ah, Pierre Antoine Birkin de Rambouillet, you are worthy of your divine mistress. Mere hunger quickly gave place to those finer instincts of the pure gourmet, and the strange wines, cooled in buckets of snow, unloosed all the decolled spirits of astonishing conversation and atrocious laughter. As the courses advanced, the conversation grew bustling and more personal. Pulex and Cyril and Mariskta and Kath Helen opened a fire of raillery, and 1,000 amatory follies of the day were discussed. From harsh and shrill and clamant, the voices grew blurred and inarticulate. Bad sentences were helped out by worse gestures, and at one table Scabius expressed himself like the famous old knight in the first part of the Soldier's Fortune of Otway. Basilissa and Lysistrata tried to pronounce each other's names, and became very affectionate in the attempt, and Tala, the tragedian, robed in roomy purple, and wearing plume and buskin, rose to his feet, and, with swaying gestures, began to recite one of his favorite parts. He got no further than the first line, but repeated it again and again, with fresh accents and intonations each time, and was only silenced by the approach of the asparagus that was being served by satyrs dressed in white. Chapter 4. It is always delightful to wake up in a new bedroom. The fresh wallpaper, the strange pictures, the positions of doors and windows, imperfectly grasped the night before, are revealed with all the charm of surprise when we open our eyes the next morning. It was about 8 o'clock when Fanfrelucky awoke, stretched himself deliciously in his great plume four-post bed, murmured what a pretty room, and freshened the frilled silk pillows behind him. Through the slim parting of the long flowered window curtains, he caught a peep of the sunlit lawns outside, the silver fountains, the bright flowers, the gardeners at work, and beneath the shady trees some early breakfasters, dressed for a day's hunting in the distant wooded valleys. How sweet it all is, exclaimed the Abbé, yawning with infinite content. Then he lay back in his bed, stared at the curious patterned canopy above him and nursed his waking thoughts. He thought of the Romaunt de la Rose, beautiful, but all too brief. Of the Claude in Lady Delaware's collection. Of a wonderful pair of blonde trousers he would get Madame Belville to make for him. Of a mysterious park full of faint echoes and romantic sounds. Of a great stagnant lake that must have held the subtlest frogs that ever were, and was surrounded with dark unreflected trees, and sleeping fleurs de luce. Of Saint Rose, the well-known Peruvian virgin, how she vowed herself to perpetual virginity when she was 4 years old. How she was beloved by Mary, who from the pale fresco in the church of Saint Dominic, would stretch out her arms to embrace her, how she built a little oratory at the end of the garden and prayed and sang hymns in it till all the beetles, spiders, snails and creeping things came round to listen, how she promised to marry Ferdinand de Flores, and on the bridal morning perfumed herself and painted her lips, and put on her wedding frock, and decked her hair with roses, and went up to a little hill not far without the walls of Lima, how she knelt there some moments calling tenderly upon Our Lady's name, and how Saint Mary descended and kissed Rose upon the forehead and carried her up swiftly into heaven. Saint Rose of Lima. He thought of the splendid opening of Racine's Bride and Écus. of a strange pamphlet he had found in Helen's library, called A Plea for the Domestication of the Unicorn. Of the Bacchanals of Sporian. Of Morales Madonnas with their high egg-shaped creamy foreheads and well-crimped silken hair. Of Rossini's Stabat Mater, that delightful demode piece of decadence, with a quality in its music like the bloom upon wax fruit. Of love, and of 100 other things. Then his half-closed eyes wandered among the prints that hung upon the rose-striped walls. Within the delicate curved frames lived the corrupt and gracious creatures of Barat and his school, slender children in mask and domino smiling horribly, exquisite ledgers leaning over the shoulders of smooth doll-like girls and doing nothing in particular, terrible little Pierrots posing as lady lovers and pointing at something outside the picture, and unearthly fops and huge bird-like women mingling in some rococo room, lighted mysteriously by the flicker of a dying fire that throws great shadows upon wall and ceiling. Fanfrelucky had taken some books to bed with him. One was the witty, extravagant, Tuesday and Josephine, another was the Score of the Rheingold. Making a pulpit of his knees he propped up the opera before him and turned over the pages with a loving hand, and found it delicious to attack Wagner's brilliant comedy with the cool head of the morning. Once more he was ravished with the beauty and wit of the opening scene, the mystery of its prelude that seems to come up from the very mud of the Rhine, and to be as ancient, the abominable primitive wantonness of the music that follows the talk and movements of the Rhine maidens, the black, hateful sounds of Alberic's love-making, and the flowing melody of the river of legends. But it was the third tableau that he applauded most that morning, the scene where Loge, like some flamboyant primeval scapeman, practices his cunning upon Alberic. The feverish insistent ringing of the hammers at the forge, the dry staccato restlessness of mime, the ceaseless coming and going of the truck of Nibelungs, drawn hither and thither like a flock of terror-stricken and infernal sheep, Alberic's savage activity and metamorphoses, and Loge's rapid, flaming tongue-like movements, make the tableau the least reposeful, most troubled and confusing thing in the whole range of opera. How the Abbé rejoiced in the extravagant monstrous poetry, the heated melodrama, and splendid agitation of it all. For the third tableau of Das Rheingold. At 11 o'clock Fanfrelucky got up and slipped off his dainty night-dress. His bathroom was the largest and perhaps the most beautiful apartment in his splendid suite. The well-known engraving by Lauret that forms the frontispiece to Millevoye's Architecture du XVIIIme siècle will give you a better idea than any words of mine of the construction and decoration of the room. Only in Lauret's engraving the bath sunk into the middle of the floor is a little too small. Fanfrelucky stood for a moment like Narcissus gazing at his reflection in the still-scented water, and then just ruffling its smooth surface with one foot, stepped elegantly into the cool basin and swam round it twice very gracefully. However, it is not so much at the very bath itself as in the drying and delicious frictions that a bather finds his chiefest choice, and Helen had appointed her most tried attendants to wait upon Fanfrelucky. He was more than satisfied with their attention, that aroused feelings within him almost amounting to gratitude, and when the rites were ended any touch of homesickness he might have felt was utterly dispelled. After he had rested a little, and sipped his chocolate, he wandered into the dressing room, where, under the direction of the superb Dancourt, his toilet was completed. As pleased as Lord Foppington with his appearance, the Abbé tripped off to bid good morning to Helen. He found her in a sweet white muslin frock, wandering upon the lawn, and plucking flowers to deck her breakfast table. He kissed her lightly upon the neck. "I'm just going to feed Adolphe," she said, pointing to a little reticule of buns that hung from her arm. Adolphe was her pet unicorn. "He is such a dear," she continued, "milk white all over, excepting his nose, mouth, and nostrils. This way." The unicorn had a very pretty palace of its own made of green foliage and golden bars, a fitting home for such a delicate and dainty beast. Ah, it was a splendid thing to watch the white creature roaming in its artful cage, proud and beautiful, knowing no mate, and coming to no hand except the queen's itself. As Fanfrelucky and Helen approached, Adolphe began prancing and curvetting, pawing the soft turf with his ivory hoofs and flaunting his tail like a gonfalon. Helen raised the latch and entered. "You mustn't come in with me, Adolphe is so jealous," she said, turning to the Abbé, who was following her, "but you can stand outside and look on, Adolphe likes an audience." Then in her delicious fingers she broke the spicy buns and with affectionate niceness breakfasted her snowy pet. When the last crumbs had been scattered, Helen brushed her hands together and pretended to leave the cage without taking any further notice of Adolphe. Adolphe snorted. Aubrey Beardsley. 1. The chef d'oeuvre, it seems to me, of an adorable and impeccable master, who more than any other landscape painter puts us out of conceit with our cities, and makes us forget the country can be graceless and dull and tiresome. That he should ever have been compared unfavorably with Turner the weights of landscape painting seems almost incredible. Corot is Claude's only worthy rival, but he does not eclipse or supplant the earlier master. A painting of Corot's is like an exquisite lyric poem, full of love and truth, whilst one of Claude's recalls some noble eclogue glowing with rich concentrated thought. At an age, writes Duvenet, when girls are for the most part well confirmed in all the hateful practices of coquetry, and attend with gusto, rather than with distaste, the hideous desires and terrible satisfactions of men. All who would respire the perfumes of Saint Rose's sanctity, and enjoy the story of the adorable intimacy that subsisted between her and Our Lady, should read Mother Isola's ineffable and miraculous life of the Flower of Lima, published shortly after the canonization of Rose by Pope Clement X in 1671. Truly, exclaims the famous nun, to chronicle the girlhood of this holy virgin makes as delicate a task as to trace the forms of some slim, sensitive plant, whose lightness, sweetness, and simplicity defy and trouble the most cunning pencil. Mother Ursula certainly acquits herself of the task with wonderful delicacy and taste. A cheap reprint of the biography has lately been brought out by Jallet and Son. A comedy ballet in one act by Philippe Savard and Tichers de Skentifleur. The Marquis de Vandesier, who was present at the first performance, has left us a short impression of it in his memoirs. The curtain rose upon a scene of rare beauty, a remote Arcadian valley, a delicious scrap of Tempe, gracious with cool woods and watered with a little river as fresh and pastoral as a perfect fifth. It was early morning and the rearisen sun, like the prince in the sleeping beauty, woke all the earth with his lips. In that golden embrace the night dews were caught up and made splendid, the trees were awakened from their obscure dreams, the slumber of the birds was broken, and all the flowers of the valley rejoiced, forgetting their fear of the darkness. Suddenly to the music of pipe and horn a troop of satyrs stepped out from the recesses of the woods bearing in their hands nuts and green boughs and flowers and roots, and whatsoever the forest yielded, to heap upon the altar of the mysterious pan that stood in the middle of the stage, and from the hills came down the shepherds and shepherdesses leading their flocks and carrying garlands upon their crooks. Then a rustic priest, white-robed and venerable, came slowly across the valley followed by a choir of radiant children. The scene was admirably stage-managed and nothing could have been more varied yet harmonious than this Arcadian group. The service was quaint and simple, but with sufficient ritual to give the court of ballet an opportunity of showing its dainty skill. The dancing of the satyrs was received with huge favor, and when the priest raised his hand in final blessing, The whole troop of worshippers made such an intricate and elegant exit, that it was generally agreed that Titurel had never before shown so fine an invention. Scarcely had the stage been empty for a moment, when Sporian entered, followed by a brilliant rout of dandies and smart women. Sporian was a tall, slim, depraved young man with a slight stoop, a troubled walk, an oval impassible face with its olive skin drawn lightly over the bone, strong, scarlet lips, long Japanese eyes, and a great gilt toupet. Round his shoulders hung a high-collared satin cape of salmon pink with long black ribbons untied and floating about his body. His coat of sea-green spotted muslin was caught in at the waist by a scarlet sash with scallop edges and frilled out over the hips for about 6 inches. His trousers, loose and wrinkled, reached to the end of the calf, and were broaded down the sides and rushed magnificently at the ankles. The stockings were of white kid with stalls for the toes, and had delicate red sandals strapped over them. But his little hands, peeping out from their frills, seemed quite the most insinuating things, such supple fingers tapering to the point with tiny nails stained pink, such unquenchable palms lined and mounted like Lord Fanny's in love at all hazards, and such blue-veined hairless backs. In his left hand he carried a small lace handkerchief broidered with a coronet. As for his friends and followers, they made the most superb and insolent crowd imaginable, but to catalogue the clothes they had on would require a chapter as long as the famous 10th in Pendelier's history of underlinen. On the whole they looked a very distinguished chorus. Sporian stepped forward and explained with swift and various gesture that he and his friends were tired of the amusements, wearied with the poor pleasures offered by the civil world, and had invaded the Arcadian valley hoping to experience a new frisson in the destruction of some shepherds or some satyrs naivete, and the infusion of their venom among the dwellers of the woods. The chorus assented with languid but expressive movements. Curious and not a little frightened at the arrival of the worldly company, the Sylvans began to peep nervously at those subtle souls through the branches of the trees, and 1 or 2 fawns and a shepherd or so crept out warily. Sporian and all the ladies and gentlemen made enticing sounds and invited the rustic creatures with all the grace in the world to come and join them. By little batches they came, lured by the strange looks, by the scents and the drugs, and by the brilliant clothes, and some ventured quite near, timorously fingering the delicious textures of the stuffs. Then Sporian and each of his friends took a satyr or a shepherdess or something by the hand and made the preliminary steps of a chordly measure, for which the most admirable combinations had been invented and the most charming music written. The pastoral folk were entirely bewildered when they saw such restrained and graceful movements, and made the most grotesque and futile efforts to imitate them. Dio mio, a pretty sight. A charming effect, too, was obtained by the intermixture of stocking calf and hairy leg, of rich brocade bodice and plain blouse, of tortured headdress and loose untutored locks. When the dance was ended the servants of Sporian brought on champagne, and with many pirouettes poured it magnificently into slender glasses, and tripped about plying those Arcadian mouths that had never before tasted such a royal drink. Then the curtain fell with a beautiful rapidity. It is 1,000 pities that concerts should only be given either in the afternoon, when you are torpid, or in the evening, when you are nervous. Surely you should assist at fine music as you assist at the mass before noon when your brain and heart are not too troubled and tired with the secular influences of the growing day.